I've hauled freight through the Alazan Valley for 40 years, and if you want to know the truth of how the war there ended, you will not hear it from the men who write the county histories. They will tell you it ended with a treaty and a survey line. It ended with a man riding alone into a camp full of people who had every reason to kill him, carrying nothing but a paper he'd torn up and a promise nobody believed he would keep. I was there. My name is Elias Barragan, and for most of my life I was the man who carried the mail and the flour and the nails between two peoples who wanted to be strangers to each other. My mother was from Chihuahua and my father was a Scotsman who died before I knew him, and I grew up speaking 3 tongues and belonging fully to none of them, which is a lonely way to be raised and a useful one to grow into. A man who belongs to no side is trusted to cross every line. I crossed them all. I drove my wagons up the canyon to the Mescalero camp and down again to Rincon Alto, and I heard both sides curse the other over the same river. And for years I kept my mouth shut and my wheels turning, because a freighter who takes a side does not stay a freighter long. So I saw it all. I saw the beginning, which was old blood, and I saw the middle, which was worse, and I saw the end, which was the only good thing I have ever watched 2 peoples build together. And it started, as these things do, with water. The Alazan was not much of a river. Where I forded it below the crossing you could walk across in July and wet only your boot soles. But it was the only living water for 30 miles in a country that would kill you for less, and everything in that valley bent toward it the way iron bends toward a magnet. The Mescalero had wintered along its upper canyon since before any Cade or Voss had ever been born. They ran their horses on the North Range and gathered mescal on the slopes and buried their dead under the cottonwoods where the water ran clear, and they had done it, the headman told me once, since the mountains were young. Then the cattle came. Amos Cade came into that valley when Ezra was a boy of 10, and he came the way those men came, with a herd and a Bible and a hunger that no amount of grass could fill. He built the Bar C and he did well. And then he wanted more, and there was only one thing worth more in that country than what he had, and it was that river and the North Range that drank from it. So one hard winter, when the band was low and the snow was deep, Amos Cade and Harlan Voss and a dozen men rode up the canyon and drove the Mescalero off the North Range at gunpoint and posted it as Bar C land. And when a young man of the band came down in the spring to water his horses at the crossing his people had used since the mountains were young, one of Cade's men shot him off that horse into the shallows. His name was Clee. He was 17. I hauled the lumber for his burying, and I remember the headman standing over the grave under the cottonwoods with a face like the canyon wall, and I remember thinking that no paper any surveyor could draw would ever be strong enough to hold back what was buried under that face. 2 of Cade's men died that same summer on the North Range at night, and nobody was ever tried for it, and after that the 2 peoples of the Alazan Valley did not speak. They watched. The band held to the upper canyon, and the town held to the flat, and the river ran between them carrying nobody's grief downstream. And that was the country I drove my wagons through, year on year, carrying the flour and the nails and the silence. Amos Cade died the winter Ezra turned 33. Went asleep hard and rich and woke up dead, which is more than most men get and more than he deserved. And the whole valley waited to see what the son would do with the father's country, because everything in the Alazan came down to that one question now. Would the son be his father, or would he not? I knew Ezra Cade better than most, because I hauled for the Bar C, and a man learns another man over the tailgate of a wagon. He was not his father. I had known that a long time. He was a big, slow-moving, quiet man with his hat pushed back and his father's hard blue eyes gone soft somewhere along the way, and he carried a grief in him that I never fully understood until later. He had lost a wife young before he came into his own, and he had lost something else too, some faith in himself. And he ran the Bar C well and joylessly, and he never once in all those years rode up the canyon to look at the range his father had stolen, because I think he could not stand to. But he watered his cattle at the Alazan crossing, and that is where he first spoke to Naya, though he did not know for a long while who she was. She came down to the crossing at dawn to fill water skins, which her people had every right to do, treaty or no, and Ezra was there ahead of the heat moving his cattle through, and his men were not with him. She was a tall woman, near 30 then, and she carried herself the way her father did, like the canyon wall, and she wore a man's canvas coat over her camp dress, and she was not afraid of him, which I think was the first thing that undid him. Everyone was afraid of Akade. She looked at him filling his hat for his horse, and she said, in English better than his own, "You are watering 40 head at the only crossing for a day's ride, and my grandmother is up the canyon and cannot walk to a farther one. When you are done, leave the near bank." He was so surprised to be spoken to at all, and in his own tongue and by a woman who did not drop her eyes, that he moved his cattle without a word. And she filled her skins on the near bank and looked at him once more and said, "Thank you," and walked up the canyon. And Ezra Cade stood in the river with his hat full of water and his mouth open, and no idea in the world who she was. He found out from me. He asked me a week later over the tailgate, casual as a man asking about the weather, if I knew the tall woman who watered up the canyon, and I told him. I said, "That is Naya, Nayeska. She is the headman's daughter, Ezra, and her cousin is buried at the crossing where you water your cattle, and you would do well to forget you ever saw her." He looked at me for a long time. "Her cousin," he said. "Clee," I said, "your father's men killed him in the shallows where you fill your hat. I watched that land in him. I had known him 10 years, and I had never seen him take a blow like that, and it was not a blow anyone had struck him. It was a thing he had simply never let himself look at, and now he had looked. I didn't know his name," he said finally. "No," I said, "your father made sure of that." He was quiet a while. Then he said a thing that I have never forgotten, because it was the first crack in the wall, and everything good that came after came pouring through it. He said, "I water there every morning, right where he died, and I never once thought to ask his name." And I thought, here is a man who is going to make himself a great deal of trouble. He did not forget he had seen her. That was the trouble. He was not a young fool. He was a grief-quiet man of 34 who should have known better. But he had gone most of his life without anyone speaking to him as one true person to another, without fear and without wanting anything, and Naya had, and he could not put it down. And she came to the crossing at dawn, and he was there at dawn, and neither of them would have said out loud that they had arranged it, but the river knew, and I knew, and after a while the whole valley would know, and that is where all the danger lived. They talked at the crossing. That was all at first, a few words while she filled the skins, and he held his cattle back on the far bank. But you can pour a great deal into a few words at dawn when you have been thirsty for them your whole life. She told him about the range his father took, not to accuse him but because he asked, and he listened the way I had never seen Akade listen. She told him her grandmother remembered the North Range green before the cattle, and that her people had a name for every spring on it, and that when they were driven off they lost not just the grass but all the names, and that losing the names was the part that would not heal. He told her, and this I only learned later from her, about his wife, and his father, and the joyless country he'd inherited, and the morning he'd stood in the crossing and understood he'd been watering his cattle on a boy's grave for 10 years and never asked. "I could give the North Range back," he said to her once. He said it the way a man says a thing to see if it will hold weight. And Naya, who was nobody's fool, looked at him and said, "You could, and your neighbors would burn you out and call it justice. And my brother would still hate you, because a man does not stop grieving his cousin because you handed back some grass. Do not say what you can give me, Ezra Cade. Everyone who ever came into this valley told my people what they would give us. Show me." Which was, I think, the wisest thing anyone said in that whole long war. Now I have to tell you about the 2 young men, because Romeo and his girl are only half the story, and it was never the lovers who lit the fire. It was the young men with the grief still raw in them. On the band's side there was K.A., Naya's younger brother. He had been a boy of 13 when Klee died, and he had worshipped Klee the way a boy worships an older cousin, and he had grown up straight into a hard, bright anger with no place to spend it. He wanted the war his father would not fight. He watched the cattle drink at his people's crossing, and he ground his teeth, and he had begun, that spring, to ride the range at night with 3 or 4 other young men, cutting bar C fence and running off horses, small things, the kind of small things that grow. And on the town side there was Deel Vos, Harlan's son, who was cut from the same bright, mean cloth. Deel had grown up on his father's hatred the way K.A. had grown up on grief, and the two of them, though they had never spoken a word, were the same young man wearing different skins, each of them looking for the fight that would make him a man in his father's eyes. Every valley has these two. They find each other. They always find each other. They found each other at the crossing in July, over water, the way everything in the Alazin came down to water. I was there as it happened, with a wagon load of trade goods, watering my mules. K.A. came down with a string of horses, and Deel Vos came down at the same time with 3 bar C men. Not Ezra. Ezra was up at the house. And there were words. And the words were the oldest words in that valley. And I saw Deel Vos put his hand on his gun over a river a foot deep. And I did the only thing a freighter can do, which is put my old body and my mules between 2 young fools before they can start a war. Not over my mules, I said. Not while I'm standing in it. And I stood in the crossing, an old man with no gun, between a Vos and a headman's son, and I talked, because talk was the only tool I had ever owned. I talked about nothing. I talked about the price of horses and the heat and my mule's bad hoof, and I kept talking until the blood cooled a degree. And K backed his horses up the canyon with his jaw set, and Deel Vos spat in the river and rode off, and nobody died that day. But it was close, and it taught me a thing I already knew. The lovers were not the danger. The lovers, God help them, were the only 2 people in that whole valley trying to build something. The danger was the young men and their father's grief, and the danger was Harlan Vos. Harlan Vos was the true hard heart of that country, harder than Amos Cade had ever been, because Amos at least had wanted the land. Harlan wanted the win. With Amos dead and Ezra gone soft, Harlan Vos saw the whole valley coming into his hand, and there was only one thing standing between him and the North Range and the water rights that would make him the richest man for 100 miles, and it was the Mescalero band up the canyon. So Harlan set about doing what men like Harlan always do. He went to town and he talked. He talked about depredations and stolen horses and the safety of decent families, and he got up a petition, and he sent a writer to the fort asking the army to move the band onto a reservation 200 miles south, off their water, off their dead, gone by winter. And he began, quietly, to work on Ezra Cade, because Harlan needed the Bar C's guns and the Bar C's water claim to make his war look like law. And that is where Ezra had to choose, and where I have to tell you what kind of man he turned out to be. Harlan rode out to the Bar C on a hot evening in August, and I was there loading hides, and I heard most of it because men like Harlan do not lower their voices. He laid it out for Ezra plain. The army would move the band by winter, the North Range and the water would come open, and it would all fall to the 2 ranches that had held the line, the Bar C and the /V, and all Ezra had to do was sign the petition and lend his men when the time came. "Your father started this," Harlan said. "You'll finish it. It's your birthright, boy." And Ezra Cade stood in the door of the house his father built, and he said, "My father started it by killing a 17-year-old boy at the crossing. That's the birthright, and I've decided I don't want it." I had known Ezra 10 years, and I had never once heard him raise his voice or plant his feet, and I stood there by the wagon with a hide in my arms, and I watched him do both. Harlan Vos went white, and then red, and he said the thing that I think Ezra had been waiting his whole life for someone to say, so he could finally answer it. "You've gone soft over that squaw at the crossing," Harlan said. "The whole town knows. You'd throw away your father's country for a—" He did not finish, because Ezra Cade crossed the porch and took Harlan Voss by the shirt front and lifted him half off his feet, and Ezra's voice when it came was very quiet. "Her name," Ezra said, "is Naya. And you will not say another word about her on my land." And he set Harlan down, and Harlan rode off, and I knew, and Ezra knew, that a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed, and that Harlan Voss would make him pay for it, and that the war was coming now no matter what any of us did. It came faster than any of us feared, and it came, as I should have known it would, through the two young men. Harlan did not wait for the army. Harlan was not a patient man, and now he had a grudge against a Cade on top of a hunger for a river, and he decided to force the thing. He sent Deal and a half-dozen hard men up toward the mouth of the canyon at night, on the pretext of recovering stolen horses, meaning to burn the band's grass on the North Range and drive them out before the army ever came, meaning to start it so that whoever finished it, the water came to the /V. It was an old, ugly plan, and it very nearly worked. But K.A. and his young men were riding the range that same night, cutting fence, and the two parties met in the dark on the North Range with the dry August grass all around them. And there was shooting, and I will not dress it up. A Voss man was hurt, and one of K.'s young friends was hurt worse, and the grass caught. And by the time I saw it from my camp down the valley, the whole North Range was a wall of fire against the sky, and the war everyone had been holding back for 10 years had finally come loose. I have thought a great deal in the years since about what would have happened if it had been anyone but Ezra Cade who saw that fire first from the Bar C. Because a Cade, Amos Cade, would have called out his men and ridden up to finish what the fire started. That was the whole plan. And it should have worked, and it would have, with any other man holding the Bar C. Instead, Ezra Cade saw the North Range burning and understood in a heartbeat what Harlan had done and what it meant, and he did the thing that no one in that valley on either side would ever have believed a Cade capable of. He did not call out his men to join the fight. He rode up the canyon, alone in the dark, toward a camp full of armed people who had every reason in the world to shoot him off his horse the way his father's men had shot Clee, and he rode in to warn them and to help them fight the fire. I know this because I was on the road below the canyon with my wagons when he passed me at a hard gallop, and I turned my mules and followed, because a freighter who has spent his life between two peoples cannot sit in his camp while they burn, and because I could not let that fool ride in there alone with no one to speak for him. I was the only man in the valley the band would let cross their line at night without a gun coming up, and Ezra Cade, God help him, was riding in there with nothing but his hat and his hard-won conscience, and if I had not been on that road, he would have died at the mouth of the canyon, and none of the rest would ever have happened. I caught him at the picket line, where two of K.'s young men had already thrown down on him, and I put my voice into the dark ahead of us. I called out in their tongue, which I had spoken all my life, that it was Baragon the freighter, and that the man with me came in peace and had come to help, and the guns did not fire. It was the closest I have ever come, in 40 years of crossing that line, to being killed on it. And then the headman was there. I have to tell you about the headman now, Naya and K.A.'s father, because everything turned on him, on that old man standing at the edge of his burning range with the firelight on a face like the canyon wall. He had buried a nephew at the crossing. He had watched his people driven off their grass and their springs and their names. He had held his young men back from war for 10 years by main strength of will because he knew, as young men never know, that a war his people fought against the whole tide of the whites was a war they could only lose, and lose everything. And now his range was burning and a Cade had ridden into his camp in the dark, and every reason he had ever had said to kill the man where he sat his horse and be done with the whole cursed line of them. And Ezra Cade got down off his horse in front of the headman slow, with his hands open and away from his sides, and he said, I translated it, word for word, my voice shaking, Voss set that fire, not me. I've come to help you put it out, and after that I've come to give you back the North Range and the crossing and every spring on it, because my father stole it and it was never his to give me. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me help you save your grass tonight, and we'll talk about the rest when the fire's out." The headman looked at him for a long, long moment while the range burned. And then he did a thing that took more courage than Ezra's ride, because Ezra risked only his life, and the headman risked his people's future on the word of a Cade. He said, "Then help us save it," and he turned and shouted his people to the fire break. And Ezra Cade fought fire that night shoulder to shoulder with the men whose cousin his father had killed, and I fought beside them. And Naya fought beside all of us with her canvas coat black to the elbow and her hair full of ash. And somewhere in the smoke and the beating of blankets against flame, a thing was happening that no treaty ever accomplished. We were all saving the same grass. We saved most of it. The wind turned near dawn, the way it does in that country, and the fire ran up against the burned break and starved. And when the sun came up gray through the smoke, the North Range was scorched black across half its width, but the springs were safe, and the cottonwoods at the crossing were safe, and Clee's grave was safe. And we were all of us, red and white and whatever I am, sitting down in the ash too tired to hate each other. There is nothing like a long night against a common fire for making men forget which side of a river they were born on. And Harlan Voss's plan, which was to force a war that would look like the band's fault, had instead put a Cade in the band's camp fighting their fire, and there is no undoing a thing like that. The valley woke up to a story it could not have imagined the day before. Ezra kept his word. That is the whole measure of the man, in the end, not the ride, not the fire, but what came after when the smoke cleared, and it would have been so easy to let the grand words of a hard night quietly die. He rode into Rincon Alto 3 days later, and he stood up in front of the whole town at the land office, and he signed over the North Range and the water rights his father had claimed, deeded them back to the band by the only law the whites would honor, made it a paper thing that could not be undone by any petition or any army order, and he did it in front of Harlan Voss and every man who had signed Harlan's paper. And when it was done, there was not one thing Harlan could do about it. Because you cannot petition the army to remove a band from land that is legally deeded and watered by the biggest ranch in the county standing as their neighbor and their friend. Harlan tried, of course. Men like Harlan always try. He put out the word that Ezra Cade was a traitor to his own kind, and for a while some of the town believed it, and there was an ugly winter where a Cade could not walk into some places in Rincon Alto without trouble. But the thing about a valley is that most of the men in it are not Harlan Voss. Most of them are just tired and afraid and glad when someone braver than they are gives them permission to stop. And when the next spring came green on the North Range, and the band's horses ran on it, and the Barcees cattle watered at the crossing on the far bank, by an arrangement that Ezra and the headman worked out between them with me translating, and no one died and no one burned. When the valley saw that peace was not just possible but easier, cheaper, and kinder than the war had ever been. Harlan Voss found that he was the last hard man standing in a country that had quietly decided to lay its grief down, and a hard man alone is just a bitter old man. He sold the /V 2 years later and went to Texas, and Deal went with him, and I will not pretend the valley grieved. But I have gotten ahead of the part you have been waiting for, which is Naya and Ezra, and whether a rancher and a headman's daughter could marry across all that buried blood and make a home stand. They could, but not easily, and not because anyone but themselves made it hard, and I want to tell it true. Because the headman did not simply hand his daughter to the man who gave back the range, the way a man hands over a horse to settle a debt. That would have been the old ugly story wearing a kind face, and Naya would have died before she let it be that story. When Ezra came to the camp that spring, properly, in daylight, having asked me how a man does such a thing among her people, and having listened when I told him, he did not go to the headman first. He went to Naya. He found her at the crossing at dawn where it had all started, and he said, I gave the range back because it was stolen, and I'd have done it if I'd never seen you, so you'll never have to wonder. But I've seen you, and I've been half alive for a long time, and you're the first thing that ever made me want to be all the way alive, and I don't have any right to ask you anything, coming from the family I come from. So I'm not asking. I'm telling you it's true, and I'm going to keep watering on the far bank every dawn for the rest of my life, whether you ever want me or not, in case you do. And Naya, who had been told by every man who ever came into that valley what they would give her, looked at the man who had finally, at last, shown her instead, and she said she told me this herself, years later, laughing, she said, "You water on the far bank. I'll water on the near one, and we'll see how many dawns it takes you to cross it." It took him a week, she let him. The headman gave his blessing in the end, but he gave it as a father gives it and not as a headman closing a treaty, and he gave it hardest of all to Ka, because it was Ka who mattered. The boy who had wanted the war, the boy whose cousin died in the shallows, the boy who had ridden the range at night with his grief. He was the one who had to be won, or the marriage would be a wound that never healed inside the very family it was meant to bind. And here is the thing I have carried with me longest. It was not Ezra who won Ka, and it was not Naya. It was the fire. Because Ka had fought that fire beside Ezra Cade all that long night, the two of them beating flame with the same blankets, coughing the same smoke, saving the same grass, and a young man cannot fight beside a man all night and hate him clean in the morning. The hate had a crack in it now, the way Ezra's wall had had a crack. It took years to close. Ka did not stand up at their wedding with a glad heart, but he stood up. He came, and he did not look away, and a long time later, years later, when Ezra had ridden out in a blizzard to help Ka bring in horses, and the two of them had spent a cold night in a lined shack sharing one bad bottle and finally saying the dead boy's name out loud between them. A long time later, Ka named his own first son for a man who was not of his people at all, and if you know what that costs, you know everything. They married at the crossing, where Klee was buried. That was Naya's doing, and I did not understand it until the day itself, and then I understood it all the way to the bottom. She would not marry Ezra Cade in the town, or in the camp, or anywhere that belonged to one people and not the other. She married him standing in the shallows of the Alazan with the cottonwoods over her cousin's grave, on the exact ground where the war had started, because she said, and I translated it for the whites who had come, and there were whites who came, she said a marriage was no good if it only joined two people. This one had to join two peoples, and it had to do it on the wound, or it would never hold. So they stood in the river, half the band on the near bank and half the town on the far one, and Ezra Cade and Nayeska were married with the water running over their boots and a 17-year-old boy's grave in the shade behind them. And I stood in the middle of the crossing between the two banks, where I had stood my whole life, and translated the vows both ways so that everyone heard them in a tongue they knew. It is the only wedding I ever cried at, and I have been to a great many. They built their home on the North Range. Not the Bar C house. Ezra could not live in his father's house, and Naya would not, but a new place, up where the springs came out clear, on the land that had been stolen and given back, and they built it deliberately so that it faced neither the town nor the camp but the river between them. The band ran their horses on the range around it, and the Bar C cattle watered at the crossing below it, and the two peoples met, more and more, at Ezra and Naya's table, because it was the one table in the whole valley that belonged to both of them, the one place where a man from the town and a man from the camp could sit down and pass the same bread and remember, slowly over years, that they were only men. They had children. I will not tell you it was simple for those children to belong to two peoples in a country that wanted everyone to belong to only one. That is a different story, and a harder one, and it is theirs to tell and not mine. But I will tell you that they grew up on the North Range with their mother's language and their father's, with their grandfather, the headman, teaching them the name of every spring on the range that had almost been lost forever, and with their Uncle Ka, who had wanted a war, teaching them to ride. And I will tell you that the oldest girl had her mother's way of looking a man in the eye without dropping hers, and the country was better for it. Ezra Cade lived to be an old man, older than I would have guessed for a man who rode alone into a camp full of guns one night. He and Naya watered on the same bank every dawn of their lives. I know because I hauled past the crossing every week for 30 years and I saw them there, two gray heads bent over the same water, on the near bank together, where it had all started. He never went back to being a hard man. She never stopped being the tall woman in the canvas coat who told a Cade to leave the near bank. And the valley, my valley, the Alazan, grew up green and peaceful over the graves of a war that everyone had sworn could never end, because one grief-quiet man finally looked at a boy's grave and asked his name, and then did the one thing no one believed he would do, which was to give back what was never his, and to cross the river he was raised to fear. I am an old man now, and I have carried freight and I have carried mail, and once, on a night the range was burning, I carried a man's piece up a canyon in the dark on my own shaking voice. That is the load I am proudest of. People ask me sometimes, the young ones who did not see it, how a war like that could end. They think it must have taken an army or a treaty or God himself coming down. It took a man crossing a river. That is all it ever takes. I have watched it my whole life, from the middle of the crossing where I stood, and I am telling you, the water is never as deep as the men on either side believe. Somebody just has to be the first to get his boots wet. Ezra Cade got his boots wet, and I stood in the middle and translated both ways so everyone could hear. That is how the war in the Alazan Valley ended. You will not find it in the county history. But I was there, in the crossing where I had always been, and I am telling you it is true.